They laughed when the maid dared to speak. They laughed harder when she was thrown into the streets. But 5 years later, when the golden carriage stopped at their door, their laughter died in their throats. A grand carriage appeared one misty morning, rolling up to the gates of Ashworth Manor. The household staff, nervous whispers filling the air, rushed to see who it was. The whispers quickened when a footman leaned in, breathless, and murmured, "It's her, but how?" But before we jump to that moment, let me take you back to where it all began. It was the year 1808, and the grand Ashworth Manor stood proudly in the rolling English countryside. Eleanor Hart, at just 19 years old, was the head maid at the estate. She had come a long way since the death of her parents when she was only 12, forcing her to grow up fast and depend on her own wits to survive. Through tireless work, a sharp mind, and a heart full of kindness, she had earned the respect of the other servants and the nobles she served. Though the family she worked for, the Ashworths, were far from kind, Eleanor had found a strange form of security in her position. The Ashworths weren't a loving family. Lady Constance Ashworth, the matriarch, was a woman of cruel beauty. She commanded authority with an icy glare and a sharp tongue. Lord Philip Ashworth, her husband, was cold and indifferent, more concerned with the affairs of his estate than his own family. Their children, Victoria and James, were raised in an atmosphere of privilege, where their every whim was indulged. Victoria, at 18, was spoiled and snobby, while her brother James, recently returned from war, had been away for years. He had a more humble air about him, but he was often distant, more focused on his military life than the family affairs. But it was Lady Constance's cruelty that would forever change Eleanor's life. It began on an ordinary morning when the household was preparing for an event. Lady Constance called Eleanor to her chamber, accusing her of something unimaginable. She claimed Eleanor had stolen a precious ruby necklace, a piece of jewelry that held sentimental value to Lady Constance. Eleanor was stunned. She hadn't touched the necklace. She was sure of it. With the calmness she had learned over the years, Eleanor explained her innocence. She had been with the other servants, tending to the laundry and preparing the house for the evening's guests. There was no way she could have taken the necklace. Why would she risk everything she had worked for? But Lady Constance wasn't listening. She didn't want to hear reason. She only wanted to be right. The room was filled with the sounds of laughter as Victoria joined in the accusation, her sharp eyes glinting with cruelty. The servants, unsure of whom to support, remained silent, knowing better than to question their betters. They mocked Eleanor, calling her a fool for thinking she could challenge the Ashworths. Then, in a cruel twist of fate, something happened that sealed Eleanor's fate. Victoria, ever the sly manipulator, found the necklace hidden in Eleanor's small, humble room. There was no doubt in their minds now. The evidence was there. Eleanor's heart sank as she realized what had happened. Victoria had planted it, hoping to make her the scapegoat for a crime she didn't commit. The entire household had turned against her, and despite her protests, Eleanor was cast out. Without a reference, without a penny to her name, she was forced to leave Ashworth Manor in disgrace. The last words she heard from Lady Constance were laced with venom. "The truth will never save you, my dear. You will die in a gutter, just like all the thieves," she sneered. Eleanor stood tall, her pride intact despite the harsh words. She spoke with a quiet dignity. "The truth has a way of revealing itself, my lady. I pray you remember your cruelty when that day comes." With those words, she turned and walked out of the mansion, leaving behind the life she had known. She had been humiliated, but she was not defeated. The world may have thrown her out, but Eleanor Hart knew deep down that her time would come. One day, her worth would be recognized, and she would prove the Ashworths wrong. As Eleanor walked down the long driveway of Ashworth Manor, the wind seemed to carry away the echoes of the laughter that had followed her out. It was the beginning of a journey that would change everything for her. But for now, she had nothing but a broken heart and the weight of a false accusation to bear. Little did she know, that very night, as she stood outside in the cold, the wheels of fate were already beginning to turn. Eleanor's situation grew more desperate with each passing day. The bitterness of her dismissal from Ashworth Manor gnawed at her, But it was the cruel reality of having nowhere to go, no family to turn to, and no money to buy even a simple meal that truly consumed her. She had been humiliated, cast out like a worthless piece of cloth, and now she was struggling just to survive. With winter quickly approaching, Eleanor's circumstances became even more dire. She tried every option she could think of, appealing to distant relatives, seeking refuge with friends who might have once taken pity on an orphan girl like her. But it was all in vain. Lady Constance's reputation as a strict, unforgiving woman had spread far and wide, and her word was as good as law. The whispers of Eleanor's so-called crime had followed her everywhere. No household would take her in, no employer would offer her work, and she quickly became a pariah in the very world she had once served. As days passed, Eleanor was left with only the cold to comfort her. She wandered the streets, her body thin and weak from hunger, her heart heavy with the sting of betrayal. She took refuge wherever she could, sometimes in the shadowed corners of stables, other times huddled in abandoned buildings, but always with a quiet, fierce resolve that no matter how low she sank, she would not lose herself entirely. A few days before Christmas, Eleanor's situation hit rock bottom. She had spent the past 2 nights sleeping in a stable, where the air was biting and the straw offered little warmth. She barely ate, her stomach growling with hunger as she pulled her threadbare cloak tighter around her. She could no longer hide her desperation. It was plain to see in her gaunt face and sunken eyes. With no other option, she stood at the entrance to a small coaching inn, hoping for a bit of charity or perhaps a warm meal. But as the hours passed, no one seemed to take notice of her. It was then that the frailty of age caught her attention. An elderly woman had appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, walking slowly with a slight stumble. The woman, dressed in fine clothes, looked like someone who should have been at home by a fire, not out in the cold of the countryside. Eleanor's instincts kicked in. Despite her own aching hunger and exhaustion, she rushed to the woman's side, offering her arm to steady her. The woman stumbled, nearly collapsing in Eleanor's arms, her face flushed with fever. It became clear that the woman was ill, and Eleanor immediately recognized the signs of someone on the brink of collapse. Without a second thought, Eleanor helped the woman into the nearby inn. She asked the innkeeper for help, but the man only offered Eleanor a dismissive glance, clearly uninterested in aiding someone so plainly destitute. Eleanor didn't care. She used the last of her coins to buy soup and medicine for the woman, knowing that if the woman passed away, there was no hope left for her own survival. The kindness wasn't much, but it was all she had. The elderly woman, who had been too weak to speak much, finally managed to look at Eleanor with piercing, fever-bright eyes. "Why?" she asked, her voice thin. "Why help me?" Eleanor, whose own stomach was empty and whose hands were freezing, just shrugged. "Because someone needs to," she said softly. "And because it's the right thing to do." The woman, as if deciding in that moment that Eleanor was worth her trust, gave a faint smile. "What's your name, child?" she asked. "Eleanor. Eleanor Hart," she replied, her voice carrying a note of quiet dignity that had not yet been crushed by the world's cruelty. The woman's expression softened, and she closed her eyes for a moment before speaking again. "You're a good girl, Eleanor. I can see that. Not many would have helped me when you are so clearly in need yourself." Eleanor was silent, but she felt a flicker of something deep within her, a reminder of who she was. Perhaps there was still hope. Over the next few days, the elderly woman, who introduced herself as Lady Margaret Thornfield, gradually regained her strength, and she was able to sit up and talk more. She asked Eleanor more about her story, about her life, and her fall from grace, and Eleanor told her everything. She did not hide her shame, nor did she try to downplay the injustices she faced. She simply told the truth. Lady Margaret listened carefully, her sharp eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. She did not interrupt, did not judge. After Eleanor finished, the woman was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke, her voice still weak, but filled with something that seemed almost maternal. "I've lived 64 years, child," Lady Margaret said. "And in all that time, I've met many people. Some honest, some not. But I can tell you this, there is no liar in your eyes. You are not the thief they claim you to be. I know a lady when I see one, even if she wears the clothes of a servant." Eleanor blinked, taken aback by the woman's words. You truly believe me?" she asked softly. "I do," Lady Margaret replied, her gaze steady. "And I will help you, Eleanor. You are far more than the world has given you credit for. I can offer you a chance. I'm an old woman with no family left. I need someone who can help me with my affairs, someone who can learn what I know and take over when I am gone. I have no children to pass my legacy to, but I see something in you, something I've seen in myself when I was young." Eleanor, still reeling from a kindness, could barely believe her ears. "But why would you help me?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You don't even know me." Lady Margaret smiled faintly. "Because, child, sometimes we see ourselves in others. I was once in your position, and now I offer you the chance to change your life. Come with me to Thornfield Hall. I have much to teach you. You are not meant to live in the gutter, Eleanor. I can give you something far greater, a future." For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope. She had nothing to lose and everything to gain. There was no hesitation in her heart. She accepted Lady Margaret's offer. With nothing left but the clothes on her back and the kind-hearted stranger by her side, Eleanor left behind the streets that had nearly consumed her. They traveled together in Lady Margaret's carriage, the snow falling softly around them, the fire within Eleanor's heart rekindled by the kindness of a stranger who had seen the woman she could become. This was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of something new. Eleanor didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to find out. And with Lady Margaret Thornfield as her guide, she believed that perhaps, just perhaps, she might one day find the dignity and justice that had long been denied to her. Eleanor's life at Thornfield Hall began as a world of new experiences and, for the first time in years, security. The grand estate, nestled in the rolling hills of Cornwall, was far removed from the cold, heartless streets she had once wandered. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the elderly widow who had taken her in, had no intention of treating Eleanor as a mere companion. Lady Margaret was determined to give Eleanor everything she had never had, the chance to become something more than a maid, more than the label society had unfairly placed on her. From the moment they arrived, Lady Margaret set the course for Eleanor's transformation. She had a vision for Eleanor, one that went beyond merely providing her with shelter. Lady Margaret wanted to pass on her own wealth of knowledge, her refinement, and most importantly, her position in society. Eleanor's education, which had once been limited to practical skills for survival, would now expand to include subjects that would prepare her for a life of sophistication and respect. Lady Margaret, who had once been of lower birth herself, saw something in Eleanor that reminded her of her own past, an intelligent, capable young woman, lost in the wrong circumstances. Eleanor's education began immediately, with lessons in reading literature, history, and philosophy. It was a strange new world for Eleanor, who had never imagined that such knowledge could be for someone like her. Lady Margaret taught her not only how to read the classics, but also how to understand them, to analyze and discuss the great works of writers and thinkers. Eleanor absorbed everything with a thirst for knowledge she hadn't known she had. Soon, she was reading the works of Shakespeare, Byron, and Austen with ease, discussing them with a depth of understanding that surprised even Lady Margaret. Alongside her intellectual development, Lady Margaret insisted that Eleanor learn the arts and manners of the nobility, skills that would ensure she could navigate the highest circles of society. Music was one of these skills. Eleanor had never touched a piano before, but Lady Margaret, who was an accomplished pianist herself, saw potential in Eleanor's delicate touch. She insisted that Eleanor learn the pianoforte and later the harp. It wasn't long before Eleanor could play both instruments well, filling the halls of Thornfield Hall with the gentle strains of classical music. Her education also included the finer aspects of social conduct, etiquette, deportment, and dancing. Eleanor learned how to move with grace, how to speak with confidence, how to hold herself in any situation, and how to engage in conversation with people of all social standings. Lady Margaret made sure she understood the rules of the game, the delicate balance of power and manners that allowed one to move through the world without being disregarded. Eleanor also learned the practical aspects of managing an estate. She studied the finances, the management of tenants, the intricacies of running a household, and how to handle the servants and tradespeople who worked on the land. Lady Margaret believed that Eleanor needed to understand the responsibilities of those in charge, so she could not only inherit her knowledge, but also carry it forward with a sense of purpose. As Eleanor learned these new skills, she began to blossom. Her once downtrodden spirit began to shine with a quiet confidence. Her transformation was not only physical, though she became healthier, stronger, and more refined, but emotional as well. She began to see herself as more than the girl who had been cast out by the Ashworths. She had a new sense of worth, one that came from within. It wasn't just about wealth or status. It was about her sense of self, her dignity, and the knowledge that she could stand on her own 2 feet in any situation. Lady Margaret's health, however, began to decline after 2 years. She had always been fragile, but the years of hard living had taken their toll. Eleanor noticed the change gradually. The way Lady Margaret's once steady hands would tremble, how she would tire more easily, and how her sharp eyes would sometimes seem distant. Eleanor cared for her with the same devotion Lady Margaret had shown her, watching over her as she had once watched over Eleanor. Despite her declining health, Lady Margaret never stopped teaching. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat by her bedside, Lady Margaret took her hand and smiled faintly. "I have one last lesson for you, my dear," she said, her voice softer than usual. "It is the most important one." Eleanor, who had grown to love Lady Margaret like a mother, held her hand, sensing something important was coming. "You have taught me so much already, Lady Margaret. What more is there for me to learn?" Lady Margaret chuckled lightly, though it was strained. "The lesson is not about knowledge, Eleanor. It is about who you are. You were always more than a maid. You were always a lady, even when the world couldn't see it. Now I am going to give you something no one can take from you." Eleanor felt her heart race as she listened. "You are my ward now, Eleanor. I adopted you 18 months ago, in case something should happen to me. You will inherit Thornfield Hall. You will inherit everything I have, my wealth, my name, my title. You are no longer just Eleanor Hart, orphan and servant. You are Eleanor Thornfield, Baroness Thornfield of Cornwall." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Lady Margaret had not only given her a future, but had made her a part of her legacy. She was no longer a victim of circumstance, but someone with power, position, and an undeniable place in society. The words were not just a gift, they were a declaration that Eleanor had value, that she had always had value, even when others had tried to strip it from her. As Lady Margaret spoke those final words, Eleanor felt a rush of emotions, gratitude, disbelief, joy, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She had been given not just a title, but a chance to prove herself to the world. Lady Margaret's health continued to deteriorate, and though she fought with all her strength, the inevitable came. One quiet evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Lady Margaret passed away. Eleanor held her hand, her heart breaking for the woman who had given her everything. Lady Margaret's death left a void in Eleanor's life, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter. Eleanor stood in the grand hall of Thornfield Hall, now alone, but never truly abandoned. The house, the wealth, the title, they were all hers, but more importantly, she was no longer the girl who had been cast aside by the Ashworths. She was Eleanor Thornfield, a woman of dignity, intelligence, and strength. And she was ready to face the world, whatever it had in store for her. 6 months had passed since Lady Margaret's death, and Eleanor had found herself settling into her new life at Thornfield Hall, which now truly felt like home. Though still grieving the loss of the woman who had given her everything, Eleanor had learned to channel her sorrow into purpose. She had managed the estate with a level of competence and ease that surprised even herself. The wealth and titles she had inherited were important, but it was the knowledge and skills Lady Margaret had imparted to her that truly mattered. As the new Baroness Thornfield of Cornwall, Eleanor had come into her own. She worked diligently, overseeing the day-to-day operations of the estate, ensuring the tenants were treated fairly, and managing the finances with a keen eye. Yet, despite the success she had achieved, Eleanor could not completely escape the shadows of her past. She still remembered the humiliation she had suffered at Ashworth Manor, the false accusations, and the way she had been discarded. And now, an unexpected letter arrived, shaking her world once more. The letter came from Mary, an old friend from Ashworth Manor who had been a maid alongside her. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Eleanor pause. Mary wrote that James Ashworth, the son of Lady Constance and Lord Philip, had returned from war, decorated as a hero. The Ashworths were hosting a grand ball in his honor to celebrate his return, inviting all the nobility in the county. But it wasn't the ball or James's return that caught Eleanor's attention. It was the news of the Ashworth family's financial troubles. Bad investments had drained their wealth, and now they were desperate for a wealthy match for Victoria, the spoiled daughter, to secure the family's future. Mary suspected something even more troubling. She had seen Victoria act strangely the day Eleanor was dismissed, and there were whispers that Victoria was the one who had stolen the necklace, not Eleanor. The thought of returning to Ashworth Manor stirred something inside Eleanor, a mixture of old wounds, unresolved anger, and a deep-seated desire for closure. But it was more than that. The letter had stirred an instinct in Eleanor that she could not ignore. It was time to return, not for revenge, but for the truth. She had never been able to clear her name, and now she had the power and the knowledge to do so. She made up her mind. She would attend the ball. She would show them the woman she had become, and she would confront the people who had wronged her. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about proving that she had been right all along. Eleanor wasted no time in preparing. She ordered the finest gown she could find from London, a deep sapphire silk that would set her apart from everyone at the ball. She wanted to appear elegant, poised, and dignified, someone who would make an impression not just for her beauty, but for her grace and strength. She also practiced her new manners, refining every gesture, every step, until they were as natural to her as breathing. No longer would she be the frightened girl who had been humiliated in front of everyone. This time, she would stand tall and face them with all the dignity she had earned. The journey to Ashworth Manor was not a long one, but the distance between the woman who had left years ago and the woman who was returning felt immeasurable. As she traveled in her carriage, accompanied by her lady's maid and 2 footmen, Eleanor allowed herself a moment to reflect. She had not seen the Ashworths in years, but the memories came flooding back. Lady Constance's cruel words, Victoria's spiteful jealousy, and the complete lack of justice she had received. The closer they got to the manor, the more her emotions swirled. She was anxious, nervous even, but she was also resolute. She would not shrink away. When the carriage finally pulled up to Ashworth Manor, Eleanor's heart raced. The grand estate loomed before her, its familiar stone walls now distant and cold. It had once been her world, but no longer. She stepped out of the carriage, her feet steady on the ground, her back straight. As she walked up the steps to the door, she held her head high. She was no longer the maid she had once been. She was Eleanor Thornfield, Baroness of Cornwall, and she had earned her place in the world. The butler opened the door and announced her with a surprising amount of formality, Miss Eleanor Thornfield, ward of the late Lady Margaret Thornfield, Baroness Thornfield of Cornwall. The name sent a ripple of confusion through the assembled guests. The Ashworths didn't recognize her immediately. Why would they? The girl they had discarded was now a woman of consequence. Eleanor stepped into the ballroom, the sounds of conversation momentarily silenced as everyone turned to look. The room, filled with the county's elite, was adorned with the elegance befitting a grand occasion, but Eleanor's presence immediately commanded attention. She stood in the doorway for a moment, surveying the room with a calm, collected gaze. Then she walked in, her sapphire gown shimmering in the candlelight, her diamonds, Lady Margaret's gift, glinting at her throat. Lady Constance, always the picture of self-assurance, was the first to approach her. But her greeting, once warm and obsequious, now felt strained, even desperate. She did not recognize Eleanor, but when she heard the name, her smile faltered. Victoria, who had been sizing up every guest, narrowed her eyes, looking Eleanor up and down with a mix of jealousy and disdain. The sight of her made Eleanor's blood boil, but she kept her composure. James Ashworth, however, caught her eye almost immediately. He was different from the last time she had seen him. Older, more serious, and, dare she say, more grounded. His uniform, which he wore with such quiet pride, marked him as a war hero, and the kindness in his eyes was palpable. As their eyes met across the room, Eleanor felt a flicker of recognition. But there was something else too, a subtle connection that had not existed before. He approached her with a warmth that was entirely different from the coldness of his family. "Miss Thornfield," he said, bowing slightly. "It is an honor to meet you." Eleanor curtsied gracefully, keeping her voice steady. "The honor is mine, Captain Ashworth. I've heard much of your bravery." His smile deepened at her words, and they spoke for a few moments, each discovering something new about the other. For the first time, Eleanor began to see James as more than just the son of the people who had wronged her. She saw someone who, despite his lineage, was genuine and kind, someone who had earned his respect on his own merit. The evening wore on, and Eleanor danced with James once, then twice. She felt at ease with him in a way she hadn't expected. There was no pretension in their conversation, no hidden agendas, just two people sharing a moment of genuine connection. But as they danced, a gasp from the crowd broke the illusion of peace. Eleanor looked over to see Mary, her old friend from Ashworth Manor, standing in the doorway with a tray of drinks. She had seen Eleanor and, in her shock, dropped the tray, sending glasses crashing to the floor. "Miss Eleanor?" Mary's voice cracked as she spoke, and the room went silent. The guests, stunned by the revelation, whispered to one another. How could this lady, this refined woman, possibly know a lowly maid? Eleanor's gaze softened as she acknowledged Mary, giving her a slight nod. "Yes, Mary. It's good to see you again." The room was frozen, the tension palpable. Victoria was the first to recover, her voice dripping with disdain. "The thieving maid? The one who was dismissed for stealing my mother's ruby necklace." The room gasped as Eleanor stood tall, unshaken. "I was accused of theft. I was innocent. I was dismissed without proof or mercy," she said calmly. The whispers in the room grew louder, but Eleanor didn't falter. She turned her gaze toward Lady Constance, who was visibly pale, her composure crumbling. "The necklace that reappeared in your jewelry box 2 weeks after I was dismissed," Eleanor continued, her voice steady and strong. A tense silence fell over the ballroom as Lady Constance realized the truth. Mrs. Peters, the old housekeeper, spoke up, confirming Eleanor's story. "It did, my lady," she said, her voice firm. "I found it myself, but you told me never to speak of it again." The truth was out, and the room was filled with murmurs of disbelief. Eleanor's calm demeanor in the face of her former tormentors was powerful, but it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Lady Constance and Victoria, once so sure of their power, were now exposed for the deceit and cruelty they had inflicted. James, looking at his mother and sister, could hardly believe what he was hearing. But it wasn't just about the past, it was about what came next. "I was never a thief," Eleanor said, her voice ringing clear and true. "And I will not let you make me feel small again." The moment Eleanor had been dreading for years had arrived. She was finally standing in the grand ballroom of Ashworth Manor once again. She stood at the center of it all, her heart pounding as she took in the faces of those who had once looked down on her. The opulent setting was starkly different from the harsh streets she had wandered not so long ago. Yet here she was, Eleanor Thornfield, Baroness Thornfield of Cornwall, resplendent in her sapphire gown, diamonds sparkling at her throat, and her posture regal. Her entrance had stolen the attention of every guest, but it was the reactions she had longed for, the recognition of her transformation, that now swirled around her in whispers. The guests who had once mocked her were now grappling with the reality of who she had become. Lady Constance, standing tall with her usual icy demeanor, was the first to approach. She was all smiles, but they were forced smiles, the kind that betrayed her panic. She had no idea who Eleanor had become. How could she? The last time they had met, Eleanor was a lowly maid, dismissed for a crime she did not commit. Yet here she was, a lady of wealth, intelligence, and grace, every bit as poised as the nobility that surrounded her. The smile Lady Constance wore was hollow, masking the embarrassment and shock that bubbled underneath. "Miss Thornfield," she said, her voice strained as she tried to regain control of her composure. "I didn't recognize you at first. How much you've changed." The words came out too sweetly, too rehearsed, as if Lady Constance were attempting to regain some of the power she had once held over Eleanor. Eleanor, however, was not the same girl who had been cast out years ago. She stood before Lady Constance with quiet strength, her voice calm but unwavering. "Lady Constance," she said, her eyes never leaving the older woman's face. "It's been a long time." The words were polite, but the weight of the years between them was felt in every syllable. Victoria, Lady Constance's spoiled daughter, stepped forward. Her eyes narrowed with disdain as she took in Eleanor's appearance. She had never liked Eleanor, not when she had been a maid, and certainly not now that she was a baroness. Victoria's jealousy was palpable as she sized up Eleanor, her lips curling into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Well, if it isn't the thieving maid," she sneered, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "How charming to see you again, Miss Thornfield." Her words were meant to sting, but Eleanor's composure remained unshaken. She had long since learned the art of ignoring insults, of standing tall in the face of cruelty. "It's good to see you, Victoria," she replied evenly, her voice carrying the weight of all the years that had passed. She refused to be drawn into the bitterness of the past. As the night progressed, Eleanor moved through the room with grace, exchanging pleasantries with the guests who marveled at her sudden transformation. Her every step was measured, her posture regal. But it wasn't just her appearance that commanded attention. It was her presence, the quiet confidence that radiated from her. She was no longer the maid who had been cast out. She was a woman of importance, a woman who had earned everything she now held, and no one in the room could deny it. As Eleanor mingled with the guests, her gaze often found its way to James Ashworth. There was something different about him, something that set him apart from the rest of his family. James had always been the quiet one, the one who seemed more in tune with the world outside the confines of Ashworth Manor. But now, standing in his uniform as a decorated hero, he had an air of authority about him, an aura of humility that made him stand out even among the nobility. He watched Eleanor with a mixture of admiration and curiosity, as though he, too, was trying to figure out just how the girl he once knew had become the woman standing before him now. When the music began to play, Eleanor felt his gaze upon her. There was no mistaking the interest in his eyes, the unspoken recognition that something had changed between them. As the guests swirled around her, Eleanor's thoughts were momentarily distracted by the sound of a voice calling her name. "Miss Thornfield." Eleanor turned, her gaze meeting that of Mrs. Peters, the housekeeper from Ashworth Manor. The older woman looked at her with a mix of surprise and guilt, as though she had seen a ghost. "Miss Thornfield," she repeated, her voice trembling. "It's really you." There was a moment of hesitation. Then Mrs. Peters took a step forward, lowering her voice so only Eleanor could hear. "I didn't know," she said, her eyes flicking toward Lady Constance. "I never knew." Eleanor, who had always respected Mrs. Peters for the kindness she had shown her during her time at Ashworth Manor, gave the woman a warm smile. "It's all right, Mrs. Peters," she said gently. "You didn't know." The older woman looked at her, a tear in her eye, and nodded. "You always did have a quiet strength," she whispered. "I see it now. You were never what they said you were." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the woman's words, even though they could not undo the years of suffering she had endured. As Mrs. Peters walked away, Eleanor's gaze once again found James, who had approached her without her noticing. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before accepting. As they danced, the music flowed around them, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt a sense of peace. James, who had always been a quiet, introspective man, spoke to her with a kindness that seemed to reflect the person he had become during his time away at war. "I never imagined," he said as they glided across the floor, "that I would be dancing with you like this." Eleanor, still reeling from the emotions of the evening, smiled softly. "I never imagined I'd be standing here either," she replied. But life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? James nodded, his gaze fixed on her. It certainly does. And I think I've learned something tonight. I've learned that I never truly understood you, Eleanor. I see now that I never really saw you for who you were. Eleanor met his gaze, feeling a flicker of something deeper stir within her. And who do you see now? She asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. James took a breath, his expression softening. I see someone who has been wronged, but who has found a way to rise above it all. Someone who has fought for herself, who has taken what life has given her and made something of it. Eleanor's heart fluttered in her chest. She had longed for recognition, but hearing these words from James made all the difference. For the first time, someone who had known her in her darkest moments, was truly seeing her, not as the maid she had once been, but as the woman she had become. As the night wore on, Eleanor continued to dance with James, each step bringing them closer, not just in physical proximity, but in understanding. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the way he treated her not as a past lover or a victim, but as an equal, someone worthy of respect. As they spoke, they found common ground in their shared experiences, the loss of family, the burden of expectations, and the struggle to make sense of a world that had often seemed cruel and unjust. But amidst all the hardship, they also found hope in each other, in the possibility of a future that was not defined by the past. As the final notes of the music played, James looked at her with a new understanding. You've changed, Eleanor, he said, his voice filled with admiration. But in a way, you're still the same. You're still the woman I once knew, the woman who stood her ground, who never let anyone make her feel less than she was. Eleanor smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. And you, James, she said softly, are still the man who showed me that there is more to life than what we're given. You've become someone I admire greatly. As the night came to a close, Eleanor realized that this ball had not only been a turning point for her, but for James as well. The recognition she had sought was not just for herself. It was for the connection between them, the understanding that had begun to form that night. She had been humiliated, thrown away, and cast aside by the Ashworths, but now, standing in that ballroom, she was no longer a victim. She was a woman who had fought for her dignity, for her truth, and for her place in the world. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what had happened in the past, she had already won. The evening had shifted into an unexpected dance of revelations. The room, which had once been filled with whispers of Eleanor's presumed fall from grace, now buzzed with a different kind of energy, an energy that Eleanor had been silently cultivating for years. She stood at the heart of Ashworth Manor, surrounded by a sea of faces that had once ridiculed her, ignored her, and deemed her beneath their notice. But tonight, those same people were forced to reckon with the woman she had become, the woman she had always been, hidden beneath the weight of false accusations and cruelty. As the music faded and the guests mingled, Eleanor's mind began to replay the events of the night, her heart both heavy with the truth she had revealed and lightened by the unexpected support she had received. She had walked into this room with one goal in mind, not to gloat, not to revel in the downfall of her former tormentors, but to stand in her truth, to reclaim the dignity that had been stolen from her, not just in the eyes of the Ashworths, but in her own heart. She had never allowed herself to truly believe that the world could treat her with the respect she deserved, but tonight, standing here, in this room full of people who once dismissed her, something had shifted. She had been given the chance to speak her truth, and it had resonated in ways she hadn't anticipated. The realization of her own power had dawned upon her slowly, but now it burned bright within her. The ball, the fine gown, the diamonds, all of it had been a reminder of what she had earned. She had worked for this, not just in terms of wealth or status, but in the deeper sense of self-respect that had been forged through every hardship she had endured. She had earned the right to be here, to be seen. But as Eleanor basked in the unexpected warmth of her newfound power, the tension in the air thickened. It was the arrival of Mary, the maid from Ashworth Manor, that broke the fragile tranquility. Mary, who had once been Eleanor's friend, now stood frozen in the doorway, eyes wide in shock. She had been serving drinks when she first caught sight of Eleanor across the room, and the sight had nearly knocked her off balance. The tray of drinks slipped from her hands and crashed to the floor, and the entire ballroom went silent. It wasn't the crash of the tray that caught everyone's attention. It was the way the room seemed to freeze as Mary whispered, "Miss Eleanor? Can it be?" The shock in her voice was unmistakable. For the first time that evening, Eleanor felt a ripple of anxiety. She hadn't expected anyone to recognize her so quickly, least of all Mary. Mary had always been kind to her when they worked together at Ashworth Manor, but what had happened since Eleanor's departure? What had Mary seen? The silence was palpable as the guests turned their gaze to the maid, who stood frozen, her face pale and wide-eyed. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She had faced down Lady Constance's cruelty, Victoria's mockery, and the judgment of the entire household. She would not shrink now. With a steady breath, Eleanor made her way toward Mary, her heels clicking on the polished floor. As she approached, Mary's eyes widened even further, her mouth opening in disbelief. "Miss Eleanor?" she asked again, her voice trembling. "But how?" I thought. Her voice trailed off as the shock of the moment caught up with her. Eleanor gave her a soft smile, the warmth of recognition flooding her heart. "Yes, Mary," she said calmly, meeting her gaze. "It's me. It's really me." The room remained silent as Eleanor stood before her old friend, the weight of their shared history lingering in the air. There was no need for explanations. Mary could see the truth in Eleanor's eyes. She could see the woman who had risen from the ashes of a false accusation, the woman who had become something far greater than the girl she had once known. Eleanor turned to face the room, the guests watching with rapt attention. This was the moment she had feared. This was the moment when the truth she had carried in silence for so long would finally be spoken aloud. "I worked here once," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear. "3 years ago, I was the head maid at Ashworth Manor." The room erupted in whispers, some of them shocked, others doubtful. It was clear that no one had expected such a revelation, and it sent shockwaves through the guests who had come to witness the return of the Ashworth's decorated war hero. Eleanor's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the past. Lady Constance's face paled as the realization struck her, her proud features contorting with a mixture of horror and disbelief. She had hoped to bury the past, to dismiss it as a mere inconvenience, but the truth was now laid bare before her. The thief. Victoria's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, filled with scorn and disbelief. "You're the thieving maid who was dismissed." Her voice trembled with outrage, but underneath, there was a deep current of fear. Fear of the truth coming to light. "I was accused of theft," Eleanor replied evenly, her gaze locked on Victoria. "But I was innocent. I was dismissed without proof, without mercy." The words were simple, but they were enough to bring the truth crashing down. The guests who had been silent up until this point began to murmur among themselves. They couldn't ignore the evidence anymore. The room had shifted. Lady Constance, her composure faltering, opened her mouth to speak, but Eleanor's calm voice stopped her. "The necklace," Eleanor said, her voice cool and unwavering. "The one that was found in my room. The one that was discovered the day I was cast out. It reappeared in your jewelry box 2 weeks after I was dismissed. I'm sure you remember." The silence in the room deepened. Lady Constance's eyes widened, and she looked frantically around the room, as if searching for something to hold onto. But there was nothing left. Mrs. Peters, the housekeeper, who had remained silent for so long, stepped forward, her voice ringing out with the weight of truth. "It did, my lady," she said, her voice firm. "I found it myself. But you told me never to speak of it again. You said it was nothing, just a mistake. But it was never a mistake, was it?" The truth was like a heavy curtain falling, revealing the darkness that had been hidden for so long. Victoria's face turned red with rage as she tried to deny it, but the evidence was overwhelming. Mary, the maid who had once served alongside Eleanor, stepped forward, her voice trembling with courage. "I saw Miss Victoria coming from Miss Eleanor's room that day," she said, her eyes now filled with resolve. She looked nervous. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I see what happened. It wasn't Miss Eleanor who took the necklace. It was Victoria." The room fell into a stunned silence. Victoria, who had been so sure of herself, now stood exposed. Her attempts to deny the truth only made her look more guilty. "No, they're lying. They're all lying," she shouted, her voice shrill with panic. But the damage had been done. Lady Constance, unable to maintain her usual composure, looked at her daughter with a mixture of shock and disappointment. She had spent years hiding the truth, manipulating everyone around her, but now it was all unraveling. And she couldn't stop it. Eleanor, with quiet dignity, turned to face her former tormentors one last time. "The truth has a way of revealing itself," she said, her voice steady. "It always does. You may have believed I was a thief, but it was never me. And now, the truth is finally here." James, who had been standing at the edge of the room, watching the scene unfold with growing disbelief, stepped forward. His eyes, once filled with confusion, now burned with anger. "Mother Victoria," he said, his voice low and firm, "this has gone on long enough. The truth is out, and we can no longer hide from it." The confrontation was inevitable. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Eleanor had come to Ashworth Manor not for revenge, but for justice. And now, the world would finally see her as she truly was, not a thief, not a victim, but a woman of integrity, standing tall in the face of everything that had been done to her. The world had underestimated her, but tonight they would finally see her as she deserved to be seen. As the murmurs of shock and disbelief filled the room, Eleanor stood tall, her heart beating steady in her chest. She had been vindicated, and she was no longer just the maid. They had all been forced to reckon with the truth. The room was heavy with silence as James Ashworth turned to face his family, his expression one of disgust and disbelief. The words Eleanor had spoken had shattered the carefully constructed facade of respectability that Lady Constance and Victoria had tried so hard to maintain. What had once been a carefully guarded secret was now laid bare for all to see, and no amount of lies or manipulation could erase the truth. The room was heavy with silence as James Ashworth turned to face his family, his expression one of disgust and disbelief. The words Eleanor had spoken had shattered the carefully constructed facade of respectability that Lady Constance and Victoria had tried so hard to maintain. What had once been a carefully guarded secret was now laid bare for all to see, and no amount of lies or manipulation could erase the truth. Eleanor stood tall in the center of the room, her posture unwavering, as if the very strength of her presence could hold the weight of the years she had been wronged. Lady Constance's face, once flushed with pride and entitlement, had drained of color, her composure faltering with every passing second. She had always prided herself on her ability to control the people around her, to bend them to her will, but now she was powerless. Her carefully cultivated social standing, the reputation she had spent years building, was crumbling before her very eyes. And it was all because of a single undeniable truth. Her own daughter, Victoria, had stolen the necklace, planted it in Eleanor's room, and framed her for a crime she did not commit. Eleanor's calm, steady voice had cut through the chaos, exposing the cruelty and deceit that had been hidden for so long. She had not sought revenge, nor had she aimed to humiliate anyone. All she had wanted was to stand in her truth, to let the world see who she really was, not the thief they had accused her of being, but a woman of integrity and honor. And now, as the room murmured with disbelief, it was clear that the truth had done what Eleanor could never have achieved on her own. It had destroyed the Ashworths' carefully constructed world. James, standing at the edge of the room, felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had been away at war for so long, and in his absence, his family had carried on as if nothing had changed. He had trusted his mother's judgment, believing her when she claimed that Eleanor was the one who had stolen the necklace. But now, with the truth laid out before him, he saw everything clearly. He had been blind, had allowed his family's lies to cloud his judgment, and in doing so, had allowed an innocent woman to suffer for far too long. He turned to Eleanor, his voice thick with regret. "Eleanor," he said, his words trembling with the weight of his guilt. "I am so sorry. I should have known. I should have believed you." Eleanor's gaze softened, and she shook her head. "It's not your fault, James," she said quietly. "You didn't know. But now you do, and that's enough." James stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "Let me make it right," he said earnestly. "Please. I can't undo the harm my family has done, but I can help you now. I owe you that much." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She had once cared for James, had once believed that he might be the one person in the Ashworth household who would stand by her. But time and circumstances had changed, and now she had to decide whether to trust him again. She had been betrayed by those she loved, and the scars of that betrayal ran deep. Still, there was something in James's eyes, something genuine, something raw, that made her pause. She took his hand, but her voice remained firm. "I don't need your money, James. I've built my life on my own terms. But what I do need is your support, your belief in me. I need you to stand by the truth, no matter the cost." James nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I will," he said. "I swear it." The room was still as the two of them stood there, their hands clasped together in silent understanding. James's declaration was not just a promise to Eleanor. It was a vow to himself, to his own integrity, that he would no longer allow his family's lies to dictate the course of his life. He would stand for what was right, no matter the consequences. Lady Constance, her face twisted with rage and humiliation, finally found her voice. "This is ridiculous," she spat. "You're all so quick to believe her lies. She was a servant, a mere maid. What does she know about honor or truth?" Eleanor turned toward her, her gaze cold and unwavering. "I know more about honor and truth than you'll ever understand, Lady Constance," she said, her voice steady. "I've lived a life that has taught me far more about both than you could ever comprehend. And now, you will face the consequences of your cruelty." Lady Constance sneered, her face flushed with fury. "You think this changes anything? You think your little speech will undo the damage you've caused," she hissed. "I'll never let you win, Eleanor. You're nothing but a thief, a liar. And that's all you'll ever be." But Eleanor stood her ground, her eyes never leaving Lady Constance's face. "I'm not the one who's lost," she said softly. "You've lost everything, Lady Constance. You've lost your reputation, your dignity, and soon you'll lose your standing in society. Because what you did to me, what you did to others, it will all come back to you." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Eleanor could see the fear begin to settle in Lady Constance's eyes. For all her power, for all her years of manipulation, she had never truly understood the power of truth. And now, that truth was catching up with her. Victoria, who had been standing by her mother, seethed with anger, but her face was also a mask of fear. The weight of her actions had finally become too much to bear. "You don't understand," she cried, her voice high-pitched with panic. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know how it would all turn out like this." But Eleanor's gaze was unyielding. "You did it because you were jealous. You did it because you thought I was a threat. But now you're the one who's been exposed." The room was still as Eleanor's words settled in. Victoria looked around, her eyes wide with realization. The guests, once her supporters, now looked at her with disdain. She had been the one to plant the necklace, to frame Eleanor for a crime she didn't commit, and now the truth was out. Her standing, like her mother's, was slipping away. James stepped forward again, his voice firm and commanding. "Victoria, it's over," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're going to confess. You're going to tell everyone what you did, and you're going to take responsibility for it." The room fell silent as the weight of James's words settled in. Victoria's defiance crumbled, and for the first time, she seemed small, vulnerable. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I thought it would be funny. I thought I could get rid of her. I didn't think it would destroy everything." "You didn't think at all," James said coldly, his disappointment evident. He turned to face the guests. "This is the truth. Victoria framed an innocent woman, and my mother enabled it. They've both lied, manipulated, and now it's time for them to face the consequences. The room was filled with murmurs, but it was clear that James's declaration had sealed their fate. The Ashworth's power had crumbled, and their reputation was beyond repair. Lady Constance, her eyes burning with anger, could not hold herself back any longer. "You think this is over?" she spat, her voice shaking with fury. "You think the world will forget what you've done to me? I will make sure you suffer for this, Eleanor. You will never get away with it." But Eleanor, who had endured so much, who had fought for so long, stood tall in the face of Lady Constance's wrath. "I've already won, Lady Constance," she said, her voice steady and calm. "You will never have the power over me again, and that's something you'll never be able to take back." The confrontation had reached its peak. The truth had come to light, and the Ashworths had been exposed for their cruelty, their lies, and their abuse of power. Eleanor had been vindicated, not through revenge, but through the strength of her character and the undeniable power of the truth. And as the room slowly began to empty, with whispers of the Ashworths' downfall echoing through the halls, Eleanor knew that this was only the beginning. She had risen from the ashes of her past, and now she was free. Free from the lies, free from the chains that had once bound her, and free to live the life she had always deserved. She had faced her tormentors, confronted the truth, and emerged victorious. And nothing, not even the Ashworth's fury, could take that away from her. Months passed, and the once grand halls of Ashworth Manor, once filled with whispers of Eleanor's presumed downfall, now seemed eerily silent, a shadow of the empire Lady Constance and Victoria had so carefully constructed. The ball that had been intended to celebrate the return of their beloved son, James, had instead become a turning point, a moment of reckoning that neither the Ashworths nor their guests would ever forget. Eleanor Thornfield, Baroness Thornfield of Cornwall, had walked into the room that night with nothing but her truth, and in doing so, had unraveled the very foundation of the Ashworth family's false respectability. But the road to redemption, as Eleanor had discovered, was not a smooth one. Her newfound status, while a victory in many ways, was only the beginning of the hard work ahead. Though the truth had come out, and her name had been cleared, Eleanor still had to reckon with the aftermath of the events that had transpired. The Ashworths, in their disgrace, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Lady Constance, once the queen of society's elite, found herself ostracized from the circles she had once dominated. Invitations to social events dried up, and her name, once spoken with respect, was now whispered with disdain. Her pride, which had once been her armor, had turned into her weakness. And for all her bitterness and fury, Lady Constance had no one left to support her. Her daughter, Victoria, was equally lost. The charm and arrogance that had once made her the darling of Ashworth Manor had turned into desperation. She had always been a spoiled, entitled young woman, but now her actions had exposed her for the petty, insecure girl she truly was. The truth of her cruelty and jealousy had made her a pariah in the very society she had once sought to dominate. It was clear to everyone that Victoria's actions had not only destroyed Eleanor's life, but had also led to her own downfall. She had hoped that by framing Eleanor, she could secure her own place in the world, but all she had done was expose the darkness that lay within her heart. James, however, had been the one person who had seemed unaffected by his family's fall from grace. Unlike his mother and sister, who had relied on deception and manipulation, James had earned his respect through his service in the war. He had returned home as a decorated hero, but it was his character, his honesty, and his sense of duty that had truly made him stand out. As Eleanor had come to realize, there was more to James than the Ashworth name. He had never fully embraced the privilege and entitlement that came with his family's title. Instead, he had forged his own path, and in doing so, had earned a sense of dignity that made him worthy of Eleanor's respect. Yet, for all the strength he had shown in the face of his family's disgrace, there was one thing he could not escape: his own guilt. James knew that he had failed Eleanor. He had been complicit in the lies his mother and sister had spread, and for that, he could not forgive himself. His feelings of shame had caused a deep rift between him and Eleanor, and though they had shared a connection in the past, that bond had been strained by years of silence and distance. He knew he had to make amends, but he wasn't sure how to begin. Eleanor, for her part, had spent the months following the ball focused on her own healing. She had worked tirelessly to restore Thornfield Hall to its former glory, ensuring that the estate was properly managed and that the tenants were treated fairly. She had learned the delicate art of estate management from Lady Margaret, and now she was putting that knowledge to use. Thornfield Hall had become a place of peace and stability, a reflection of Eleanor's own transformation. But though she had found a sense of purpose and fulfillment in her work, her heart remained heavy. She had longed for a life of her own, free from the shadows of her past, but the ghosts of her former life still lingered. She had been betrayed by the people she had trusted most, and though she had found strength in the truth, there was still a part of her that could not forget the pain of her past. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Eleanor found herself caught in a cycle of reflection and resolve. She had grown stronger, more independent, and more capable, but her heart still carried the scars of her past. And then, one morning, as she sat in the gardens of Thornfield Hall, the sound of a carriage pulling up to the estate interrupted her thoughts. She stood and watched as the carriage came to a stop, and a familiar figure stepped out. It was James. His eyes met hers, and for a moment there was a silence between them, a silence that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. James had come to make amends, to apologize for the pain he had caused, but he knew that words alone would never be enough. He had to show Eleanor that he was no longer the man he had been. He had to prove to her that he was worthy of her trust, worthy of the woman she had become. He stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Eleanor," he said, his tone soft, "I know that I've failed you. I've failed to protect you, to believe in you when you needed it most. And for that, I will carry the weight of my guilt for the rest of my life. But I want you to know this. I'm not the man I was. I've learned so much since the day we first met, and I've learned that the truth is the only thing that matters. I'm here now, and I want to spend the rest of my life making things right." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she listened to his words. She had never expected this moment, had never imagined that James would come to her like this, vulnerable and sincere. She had always known that there was more to him than the Ashworth name, but now, standing before her, he was a man who had been changed by the same truth that had changed her. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for the sincerity she needed to see. And as she met his gaze, she saw it, the man who had once been distant and detached, now standing before her, fully present and fully aware of the depth of his mistakes. Eleanor took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so long trying to move past the pain of her past, but here was James, offering her the chance to rebuild the connection they had once shared. She had forgiven him long ago, but now she had to decide if she could trust him again. "James," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm, "I've spent a long time forgiving you, but it's not just about forgiveness. It's about understanding, about knowing that we both have a place in this world, a place we've earned through our own choices. You're not the man you were, and neither am I. But I can't be the person I was either." James nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know," he said, "and I will spend the rest of my life proving that I deserve a place in your world." Eleanor felt her heart stir with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future for them, one where they could both move forward, leaving the past behind. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it in his. "We both have a lot to learn," she said softly, "but I believe we can do it together." And with that, the past was finally behind them. The wounds that had once seemed insurmountable began to heal, not through time alone, but through the effort and commitment they both made to each other and to the future. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, Eleanor felt as though she was finally stepping into the life she had always deserved, a life built on truth, strength, and the promise of love. As she stood there, hand in hand with James, the weight of her past lifted, and she realized that she had not only survived but had triumphed. She had become the woman she was always meant to be, free, strong, and unapologetically herself. And as the sun set over Thornfield Hall, casting a warm glow over the estate, Eleanor knew that the future was hers to shape. She had earned it, and no one could ever take it away. With James by her side, she had found the peace she had longed for, and the strength to build a future filled with hope, love, and the unshakable belief that no one, not even the Ashworths, could ever again make her feel small. The woman who had once been cast aside, the maid who had been humiliated, was now a lady of her own making, and her story had only just begun.